Marked by fire. The mare reared up, wild-eyed and sweating, as if the land itself had whispered something foul into her ears. Jedediah Callahan gripped the reins with one gloved hand, his other already easing toward the rifle in the saddle scabbard. He squinted at the horizon. No coyotes, no cattle, no wind even. Just that eerie, unnatural silence that always came before something went wrong. And something was wrong. The sun beat down like a hammer, splitting the Wyoming sky wide open with a white heat that boiled the dust from the ground. The air smelled of scorched sage and brittle pine. Jed had ridden out before dawn to check the northern fence line, chasing down reports from a hired hand who'd found it cut last week. He hadn't planned to ride this far out, but the farther he rode, the more it felt like the land was hiding something, and now his horse was telling him the same thing. He dismounted, boots crunching dry underbrush, and ran a rough hand over his jaw. The summer beard itched against his calloused fingers. He scanned the ridgeline again, then let his eyes drift lower to the run-down barn, half swallowed by creeping weeds and thyme. It had once been part of an older homestead, long since abandoned. He hadn't thought about it in years. But now, there was something in the air around it that crawled under his skin. Then he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Faint, ragged, a whimper. Human. Jed froze. Every instinct screamed to turn back. This wasn't his business. He'd seen enough ugliness in his life to know when to steer clear. But the sound came again, clearer this time. A woman's moan, broken and raw, like a soul tearing in half. He swore under his breath and moved toward the barn. The doors hung crooked, one off its hinge, the other clawed with age. He pushed inside, his hand tight around the stock of his rifle. Dust swirled in the slanting light. It smelled of old hay and older blood. And then he saw her. She was lying on her side, half buried in scattered hay, arms and ankles bound with rough rope. Her dress, what was left of it, clung to her like a second skin, soaked in sweat, dirt, and blood. Pale strands of hair clung to her face, and one eye was swollen shut. The other flickered open, glassy and terrified. Jed knelt beside her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice dry from the heat and disbelief. "Can you hear me?" She flinched. Her lips moved, but nothing came out at first. Then a whisper, a rasp so soft it nearly vanished in the stillness. "Please don't lift my skirt." Jed froze. The plea wasn't just desperate. It was humiliated, fractured. It wasn't modesty. It was something deeper, a warning. But the blood soaked into the lower half of her dress told its own story. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I have to stop the bleeding." Her head barely moved, her eyes fluttering shut as if bracing herself for another kind of pain. Jed's hands, steady from years of ranching and breaking stallions, now trembled as he gently lifted the hem of her skirt. And there it was, carved into the flesh of her upper thigh, still raw and bleeding. 4 words that turned his stomach to stone, owned by Monsieur Graves. The letters were jagged, deliberate, burned into her like a brand. Not just a message, a signature. Jed recoiled slightly, his throat tightening. His mind immediately conjured a face he hadn't seen in years. Mason Graves, wealthy, untouchable, ruthless. The man had fingers in every land deal from Cheyenne to Helena. People said he made problems disappear. And now this. Jed lowered the skirt gently, as if to shield her from the obscenity. The woman lay still, her breathing shallow, as if her soul was waiting to see whether this man would leave her too. He wouldn't. No matter how much his gut told him to ride away, to let someone else find her, to not poke the bear that was Mason Graves, he couldn't leave her here. Not like this. Not marked like livestock and discarded like trash. "I'm getting you out of here," he muttered, more to himself than her. He cut the ropes, careful not to make her flinch more than she already had. When she whimpered, he whispered back something quiet, steady, not scripture, not comfort, just presence. A promise that he was real, and that he wouldn't walk away. He bundled her in the old saddle blanket and lifted her into his arms. She was light, too light, like a body half given to death. The mare spooked when he approached, but he calmed her with a touch and hoisted the woman into the saddle, securing her gently against his chest. He mounted behind her and turned the horse south toward the ranch. The sun was low by the time the Callahan ranch came into view, a long wooden house perched against the edge of a grove of pines, backed by the Tetons like jagged teeth. Inside, Jed laid her on his own bed, stripped her out of the filthy rags she wore, and began the quiet work of survival. Boiling water, grinding herbs, cleaning wounds that refused to stop bleeding. He didn't speak, not at first, because there was nothing left to say, only something left to do. And for the first time in years, Jed Callahan felt something close to purpose. He didn't know who this woman was. He didn't know what she had seen. But he knew what she carried now, a name carved into her body, a truth no one was supposed to live to tell. The awakening. The first thing she asked for when she woke again was water. Jed heard her whisper it, dry, scratchy, barely more than a breath, while he was mixing crushed yarrow into a warm compress. He turned quickly, kneeling at her side with the tin cup he'd left cooling on the windowsill. Her lips trembled as she tried to sit up, but her strength failed her halfway. "Easy," he said, sliding an arm behind her back. He lifted her carefully, cradling her like something fragile. Slow sips. She drank. Not much, just a little, but her eyes fluttered open for longer this time. Not just dazed or fearful, but focused, aware. She watched him in silence as he eased her back down onto the bed. "You're safe here," Jed said, setting the cup aside. "Name's Jed Callahan. This is my ranch." She stared at him for a long moment, then closed her eyes. That was all right. He didn't expect answers. Not yet. The next few days passed in rhythms of silence, shadow, and slow recovery. Jed tended to her wounds every morning and night, unwrapping bandages, cleaning blood-crusted gashes, and applying the poultices he knew from his years of living too far from town doctors. She flinched often, but never screamed. Sometimes she bit her lip until it bled. Not once did she complain. The carved letters on her thigh scabbed slowly, the edges raw and inflamed. He tried not to look longer than he needed, but they were always there, taunting him. Owned by M. Graves. It didn't just stain her skin. It crawled into his bones. Jed didn't say much during those days, and neither did she. But he noticed how her eyes followed him now. Not fearful, just watchful, measuring him, as if trying to decide if he was real, or if this sanctuary was just another trick before the next pain arrived. He never asked her what happened, not because he didn't care, but because some things needed to be given freely. And one evening, she did. It started with a single sentence. "My name is Annabelle Halt." He looked up from where he was sharpening his knife, pausing mid-stroke. She was sitting up, propped on pillows he'd stuffed with fresh straw. Her hair was still matted in places, her cheeks hollow, but her eyes were clear now. "Annabelle," he said softly, nodding. "You remember where you're from?" "Cheyenne." Her voice cracked. "Well, outside Cheyenne. I used to work at a land survey office part-time. My father was a cattle broker. He died last year." She looked down at the blanket gathered in her lap, her fingers tightening around it. "I saw something I wasn't supposed to," she said. Papers, land claims, deeds, old ones, real ones, and new ones forged with different signatures, different names. Jed didn't interrupt. He just listened. "There was a man," she continued, her voice growing brittle. "Mr. Abernathy. He had this beautiful ranch near the river. He came in confused, said his land had been taken, that the county said he'd sold it, but he hadn't. I saw the documents. I knew what they'd done." Her hands trembled now. I mentioned it to one of the clerks. He told me to keep quiet, said Graves had ears everywhere. I should have listened." "Mason Graves," Jed said, more of a confirmation than a question. She nodded. They came for me at night. 2 men. I never saw their faces. They said if I didn't tell them who else I'd told, they'd make sure I'd never speak again. She swallowed hard. I hadn't told anyone. Not really, but they kept asking, kept cutting. Her hand drifted to her thigh, to the scar she hadn't touched in days. That, she whispered, that was his idea. Graves. He wanted to mark me, so I'd always remember. Jed felt something burn low in his chest, a deep, steady rage. Not the kind that made you lash out, but the kind that rooted itself in your marrow and waited. Cold, patient. They left me in that barn, thinking I'd die slow, she said, voice breaking. If you hadn't found me. She didn't finish. Jed stood abruptly, walked to the stove, and stoked the fire just to give himself something to do, something to punch. Annabelle didn't speak again that night. She didn't have to. The weight of the past. The next morning, Jed woke early. The sun hadn't cleared the peaks yet, but the sky was already bleeding orange. He saddled the mare, packed a satchel, and told Annabelle he'd be gone half a day. "Where are you going?" she asked, her voice thick from sleep. "Town," he said. "Need to buy more bandages, salt, other things." She looked at him for a moment longer than necessary. "You're not going to the sheriff?" Jed's jaw clenched. "No." She didn't ask why. He returned that evening with supplies and news. Graves wasn't in Cody. He was up in Casper for some business deal, but his name carried weight even in his absence. The men Jed asked about the barn barely met his eyes. He didn't tell Annabelle that part. Not yet. That night after dinner, she looked up at him across the cabin's small wooden table and said, "Why didn't you walk away?" Jed didn't answer right away. "Because I've walked away before," he said finally. "Too many times." She didn't ask for more. She simply nodded. And for the first time, Jed saw something flicker behind her eyes that wasn't fear or pain. It was resolve. He realized then that this wasn't over. Not for her, and not for him. Not with that name carved into her skin like a signature on a deed. Not while Graves still breathed. The third night it rained. Not a hard storm, but a steady patter that tapped on the tin roof of the cabin and softened the world outside to a hush. Jed sat in his usual place, one boot propped against the hearthstone, a book open, but unread in his lap. Across the room, Annabelle lay on the bed, half dozing, one arm draped over her stomach. Her breathing was deeper now, more even. She was healing, but not just in her body. He'd watched it happen quietly, piece by piece. The bruises faded, the tremble in her hands eased. The nightmares still came, but less frequently, and with them came fewer cries in the night. She no longer curled inward like she expected pain with every word. That evening she'd insisted on helping, however little she could. She'd stood at the table, her legs still shaky beneath her, slicing dried onions while he stirred the pot on the stove. Her hands moved slowly, awkwardly, but there was a kind of stubborn pride in it. She was reclaiming something. Jed had seen it in her eyes, and he hadn't tried to stop her. Now, with the stew long eaten and the dishes cleaned, they sat in silence as the rain whispered across the roof. Annabelle's voice broke it. "How did she die?" Jed didn't look up. He turned a page, though he hadn't read a word. "My wife." Annabelle nodded. He closed the book and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Her name was Lorna. Strong woman. She hated silk, but loved thunder. Said storms were God's applause. He smiled faintly, then let it fade. 3 years ago, she rode into town to confront Mason Graves, said he was trying to steal grazing rights off our southern stretch. She had all the documents. The land was ours, clear and clean. But she went anyway, wanted to look him in the eye. He paused, the air between them thickening. She never came back. They said it was an accident, that her horse slipped near the ridge. Body was too busted up to prove much. Sheriff called it misadventure. But you didn't believe it. Annabelle said. Jed shook his head. Not for a minute. And you didn't go after him? He looked at her now, eyes steady. No, I didn't. Why? Because I wanted to stay alive. He leaned back. Because I was a coward. The confession landed in the room with weight. Not loud, not dramatic, just heavy. Annabelle didn't look away. You're not one now. Jed stood and crossed to the stove, stoking the fire, his back to her. No, he said. I'm not. The plan takes shape. The next day, Annabelle asked if she could walk outside. Jed helped her to the porch, where the earth still glistened from last night's rain. The air was sharp with pine, and a bluebird hopped along the railing. She sat on the bench, wrapped in a wool blanket, and breathed in deep, like she hadn't tasted clean air in weeks. How far does your land go? She asked. Jed pointed west. All the way to those hills. About 300 acres in that direction, double that the other way. You don't use it all. I used to, he said, before everything went sour. Annabelle tilted her head, curious. After Lorna died, I sold off most of the cattle. Let the hands go. Don't run the business anymore. Just keep the property, live off what I've stored, and trade a little when I need to. Sounds lonely. Jed didn't answer. He simply looked out across the hills where the grass moved like waves. I envy you, she said after a while. He turned to her, confused. Envy me? You have space, air, land no one can take from you. Jed sat beside her. Even land this wide doesn't keep trouble out. No, she said, but it gives you a place to fight from. They sat there for a long while, listening to the wind in the trees. That afternoon, Jed rode out for firewood. When he returned, Annabelle was inside the cabin, standing by the stove, stirring a pot with her sleeves rolled up. You should be resting, he said. She glanced back with a half smile. I rested enough. He dismounted, watching her quietly from the doorway. Her back was straighter. Her hair had been tied back with one of Lorna's old scarves. She looked solid again, present. Over supper, she asked a question that caught him off guard. Do you believe in redemption? He studied her face for a moment. I used to. Now I believe in choices. She nodded like she understood something deeper than what was said. I want to help, she said. You already are. No, I mean with Graves. I can't just disappear. He'll do it again to someone else. He doesn't get to keep doing this. Jed's jaw tightened. You know what standing up to him costs. I already paid, she said, tapping her thigh. He looked down, silent. I saw what he is, she continued. I know who else was in that room. I remember their faces, and I still have copies of the land deeds. I mailed them to myself before they took me. Where? A Dropbox in Cheyenne. They're still there, unless Graves found them. Jed sat back, considering. Then we go. She blinked. We? You're not doing this alone. A long silence stretched between them, heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Annabelle whispered, Thank you. Jed reached for the bottle of rye and poured 2 glasses. To surviving, he said. Annabelle lifted hers. To fighting back. As the fire crackled behind them, neither one said it aloud, but they both knew this wasn't about justice. It was about finishing something they should have never had to start, and it would end the way all things in the West did, with blood or with silence. The journey to Cheyenne. Jed had been to Cheyenne hundreds of times in his younger days, but never like this. Not with a woman beside him who carried scars beneath her clothes and steel in her eyes, not with the kind of weight that pressed down on your spine and made every mile feel like a question you didn't want answered. They left Callahan Ranch before dawn, the world still wrapped in morning mist and silence. Jed rode out first, scanning the horizon. Annabelle followed on a second mare he'd saddled for her, a quiet, strong thing named Penny, with a smooth gait and even temper. She was still recovering, still stiff when she moved. But she never asked to stop, never once looked back. Cheyenne was 3 days' ride if they moved steady. The plan was simple: retrieve the documents Annabelle had hidden, then disappear before Graves or any of his dogs caught wind. But plans had a way of unraveling out here. They rode in silence the first day, pausing only for water and quick bites from their satchels. Jed watched her often, not because he didn't trust her, but because he was starting to feel something he didn't quite have the words for. Admiration, maybe, or something deeper, older, a recognition of pain shared in different forms. That night they made camp near the edge of a dried creek bed. Jed built a fire while Annabelle gathered kindling with a limp she was trying to hide. When they sat down, the stars above them seemed impossibly close, like the sky had lowered itself to bear witness. "You sure you're ready for this?" Jed asked, passing her a tin cup of warm coffee. Annabelle nodded. "Been ready since the night you found me." He looked at her for a long time. "You ever think about running instead?" "All the time," she admitted. "But it's not about fear anymore. It's about not letting him decide who I get to be." Jed stirred the fire with a stick. "He marked you like property." Her jaw clenched. "Then I'll burn the deed." Neither of them slept much that night. By the second day, the land began to change. The hills flattened. Trails turned to rutted roads. More signs of civilization appeared: telegraph lines, broken fences, distant smoke from morning cook fires. They stayed off main roads, cutting through wooded passes and old ranch lanes. Jed knew these lands well enough to move without drawing too much attention. Just before dusk, they passed a rider headed in the opposite direction. Jed tipped his hat politely, but the man only gave a hard glance before urging his horse on. Annabelle waited until they were out of earshot. "You think he recognized us?" Jed shook his head. "Don't think so, but folks don't look kindly on strangers riding two to a cause. We keep our heads low." They camped that night in a grove of cottonwoods. The wind picked up, and the sky threatened more rain. As Jed secured the horses, Annabelle sat by the fire, sharpening her knife with deliberate strokes. Her hands were steady now, surer. "You ever killed a man?" she asked suddenly. Jed turned to her. "Yes." She nodded slowly, eyes reflecting the flames. "Does it stay with you?" "Every day," he said. "But less when you know you did it for the right reason." "And when you're not sure?" He didn't answer. Trouble in Cheyenne. They reached Cheyenne by mid-morning on the third day, entering from the east under a haze of low clouds. Jed pulled his hat low, his coat collar higher. Annabelle wore her scarf tight, the old bruises on her neck mostly faded but still sensitive. The city buzzed with late summer energy. Wagons creaked past storefronts. Men haggled at supply stands. Children darted between horses and carts. No one paid them much mind, which suited Jed just fine. They hitched their horses in a narrow alley near a general store. Annabelle led him 3 blocks north to a small post office tucked between a saddler and a butcher. The sign was faded, the window dusty. Inside, a young clerk with ink-stained sleeves looked up from behind the counter. "Help you?" Annabelle stepped forward. "I'm here for a package." General delivery, sent by A. Holt. The clerk flipped open a ledger, scanning down the names. "Got it," he said finally, retrieving a small wrapped parcel from the back shelf. "Been here a while. Was about to send it to Dead Letters." Jed stood close, eyes scanning the street through the front window. Annabelle accepted the parcel with trembling fingers. She didn't open it. Not yet. They didn't linger. Back in the alley, Jed cut the string and unwrapped the package atop a crate. Inside were 3 folded deeds, 1 letter, and a worn black notebook. Annabelle pointed to the pages. "This one's the original for the Abernathy Ranch. That signature, his real one. And here, this is what Graves submitted a week later. You can see the forge marks." Jed studied the documents, jaw tightening. "He's been doing this for years," she said. Forging, intimidating, sometimes killing. This ledger has names, witnesses, people he bought off. Jed closed the notebook. This gets out, Graves loses everything. Annabelle looked up at him. Which means he'll kill to keep it quiet. Jed nodded. We don't mail this. We hand it over in person, but not here. Not now. He tucked the items back into the wrapping just as a sharp voice called from the far end of the alley. Well, hell, I didn't think you'd be stupid enough to come back. They turned. A man stepped into view, slender, sunburnt, with a revolver at his hip and a scar twisting the left side of his mouth. Jed recognized him immediately. Ray Tolbert, one of Graves's oldest hounds. Behind him, two more men emerged from the shadows, each armed, each smirking like they already knew how this ended. Jed moved in front of Annabelle instinctively. This ain't your fight, Callahan, Ray sneered. Give us the girl and the papers and we'll let you ride out clean. Jed's voice was cold. You know I won't do that. Ray grinned wider. Didn't think so. Then his hand twitched toward his gun, but Jed was already moving. The alley fight. The alley exploded in motion. Jed's revolver cleared leather in a blink, the thunder of his first shot echoing down the tight brick corridor. Ray Tolbert staggered back with a sharp cry, clutching his side as blood bloomed across his shirt. Jed didn't stop to watch him fall. He turned, firing again at the second man, a shorter one with a rifle already raised. The bullet caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him into the wall. His weapon clattered to the cobblestones. The third lunged forward, faster than Jed anticipated. He crashed into Jed with the weight of a full-grown bull, knocking him to the ground. The revolver flew from Jed's hand and skidded beneath a stack of crates. The man swung wild, a haymaker of a punch that glanced off Jed's temple. Dazed but fueled by raw instinct, Jed drove his knee upward into the man's ribs. The thug grunted, but didn't loosen his grip. They rolled, boots scraping pavement, fists landing dull thuds in flesh. Jed saw the flash of a knife just as the man's arm pulled back. Then came a sound, soft but cutting, a hiss of steel slicing flesh. The attacker froze. His eyes went wide, mouth hanging open like a fish gasping for air. He looked down. Blood spilled from his lower back, and behind him stood Annabelle, her knife buried to the hilt. Jed shoved the man off and scrambled upright just in time to catch her as she staggered back, her face pale, eyes locked on the dying man. You okay? He asked, hands gripping her shoulders. She nodded once, shakily. You? Will be. Ray was still alive, barely, groaning against the far wall. Jed picked up his revolver and approached. He crouched low, pressing the barrel to Ray's chest. Who sent you? Jed asked. Ray gave a pained chuckle. Who you think? He know we're in Cheyenne? No, Ray wheezed. Not yet. We were just here watching, routine sweep. Jed's jaw tightened. You ain't getting far, Ray coughed. Even if you run, Mason's everywhere. He owns the dirt under your boots. Jed leaned closer. Then I'll burn the whole damn ground. Ray tried to spit at him, but only blood came out. Jed stood. He didn't pull the trigger. Not this time. He won't follow, Jed said. Annabelle was already at the edge of the alley, her hands trembling as she wiped the blade on her skirt. She looked at Jed, eyes hard now, haunted but unflinching. We have to move, she said, before someone sees. They didn't go back for the horses. The men had left them tied further down the street, and going back would draw attention. Instead, they cut through side alleys and empty lots until they reached the edge of the rail yard. Jed paid a man to hitch them a ride under tarps on a freight wagon heading south. As they lay in the back of the cart, wrapped in musty canvas, Annabelle stared at the dark, her voice low and steady. I never killed a man before. Jed didn't reply right away. You saved my life, he said finally. He would have killed you, she said. And I didn't even think. I just moved. That's what it takes sometimes. She turned her head toward him, barely visible in the low light. Does it get easier? No, Jed said, "but it gets harder to regret it." They rode in silence for hours, the steady clatter of wagon wheels against earth and rail ties filling the spaces between them. When they reached a farmstead on the outskirts of town, Jed paid the driver extra to keep quiet and let them off before sunrise. They walked the rest of the way, 2 miles through open prairie, until the old telegraph station came into view. It was a half-abandoned building used mostly by ranchers too stubborn for town. Jed knew the man who ran it. The telegraph station's Silas Dobbins was waiting out front when they arrived, sipping from a tin cup and eyeing them like they'd been drawn from the earth itself. "Well, I'll be damned," Silas said, pushing his hat back. "Jed Callahan, thought you were buried in your own dirt by now." "Not yet," Jed said. Silas's gaze moved to Annabelle. "And who might this be?" "She's the reason I'm still breathing," Jed said. Annabelle offered a quiet nod. Silas studied her face, then stepped aside. "You two best come inside." The station was dusty but warm, the smell of pipe smoke and old paper lingering in the air. Jed sat Annabelle near the stove while he pulled the documents from his coat. "I need these sent, not by mail, by man. Trusted one." Silas opened the folder, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. "Jesus, Jed, this is a death warrant. You know that, right?" Jed nodded. "That's why it can't vanish." Not again. Silas looked between them. "And what happens when Graves finds out?" "He already knows enough," Jed said. "But by the time he knows more, I want this in the hands of the right people." Federal Marshal, Judge Holt in Laramie. Anyone not paid by Graves. "I know one," Silas muttered. "Old drunk named Mathers. But he still cares about law. I'll send it." Jed handed him a small pouch. Inside was enough money to buy silence. "We were never here," he said. Silas grunted. "Never heard your names in my life." As they stepped out into the morning sun, Annabelle paused, glancing back at the building. "Do you think this is enough?" she asked. "To stop him?" Jed watched the sky for a long moment. "It's a start." They had no horses now, no wagon, just the clothes on their backs and a head start. But they had something else, too. Truth in the right hands and blood already spilled. Graves would come. That much was certain. But when he did, Jed and Annabelle wouldn't be hiding. They'd be waiting. The return and final confrontation. The wind howled across the plains like it was warning the earth of what was coming. By the time Jed and Annabelle returned to the Callahan Ranch, on foot for the last 10 miles after catching rides with sympathetic travelers, the air felt heavier, not just with the weight of the trail they'd ridden, but with the kind of stillness that only comes before a storm. Everything was too quiet. The crows that usually perched along the fence line were gone. The barn door creaked in a slow rhythm, though there was no breeze strong enough to move it. Jed didn't speak much as they approached the ranch. He simply scanned the horizon, jaw set tight, eyes hard. He didn't need to say what they both knew. Graves had found out. Inside the cabin, Annabelle moved with silent urgency. She placed the bundle of extra bandages and ammunition they'd picked up from a trading post onto the table. Jed unstrapped the rifle from where he'd carried it across his back and checked the chamber. "How much time do you think we have?" she asked, not looking up. "Not much," he replied. "If they were watching the post office, they already know we have something worth killing for. And if Ray didn't make it back..." He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Annabelle nodded. "Then we make it count." They fortified the cabin with what little time they had. Jed blocked the windows with extra timber. Annabelle poured oil into lanterns and lined up jars of black powder they found in Jed's storage shed. Every corner of the home was turned into a weapon. As darkness fell, they heard the sound they'd both been waiting for, the distant thunder of hooves against dry ground. Jed stepped onto the front porch, rifle slung over his shoulder, the sky behind him painted with bruised purples and deep gray. The air smelled like dust and revenge. 3 riders came into view, their silhouettes outlined by the rising moon. The one in the middle was unmistakable. Mason Graves, broad-shouldered, thick-jawed, dressed in black like he thought the color made him righteous. Jed's heart pounded, but not from fear. Graves pulled his horse to a stop just outside the fence line. His voice carried across the open yard, smooth as snake oil. "Well now, Jed Callahan, I expected you to run. Thought hiding behind a girl would suit you." Jed didn't move. "You came all this way for words, or you got bullets to match that mouth?" Graves smiled. The two men beside him, Clyde and Byron, the worst of his dogs, shifted in their saddles. "Last chance," Graves said. "Hand her over, burn the papers, walk away. You get to live, she doesn't. That's the deal." Jed spit into the dirt. "You don't make deals on my land." Graves's smile vanished. "Then you'll die on it." He raised his hand. Clyde fired first, but his bullet hit the porch beam just inches from Jed's head. Jed ducked and rolled, raising his rifle and returning fire in one smooth motion. Clyde tumbled backward, a red burst blooming from his chest as he fell from his saddle. Inside, Annabelle watched through the window slit. She waited, breath slow and even. Byron made a break for the left side, circling wide on his horse to flank the cabin. She slipped out the back, barefoot and quiet, her knife already in hand. Graves shouted something, but the thunder of gunfire drowned him out. Jed caught a glimpse of Byron dismounting and moving toward the side of the house. He turned to warn Annabelle, but he didn't need to. She was already there. She moved like wind over grass, silent and swift. Byron never saw the blade until it was inside his throat. He gurgled, eyes wide, staggering into the wall as she pulled it free. He fell at her feet without a sound. Jed fired again. One more round. It missed. Graves had dismounted now, hiding behind his horse, firing in bursts toward the cabin. But he was losing ground. His men were dead. "Come out, Callahan," Graves yelled. "Let's settle this face to face." Jed stepped into the yard. "No more games," he said. "Just you and me." Graves lowered his weapon. "Fine by me." He charged. The two men collided in a crash of fists and fury, boots digging into the dirt, sweat and blood flying with every strike. Graves was stronger, heavier, fueled by years of impunity. But Jed was faster, and his rage was sharper. He ducked a wide hook and slammed his elbow into Graves's ribs. The man grunted, staggered, then came back with a punch that split Jed's lip. They grappled, tumbling to the ground, hands reaching for whatever could be used as a weapon. Graves found a rock. Jed found a reason. With a roar, he drove his forearm into Graves's throat, slamming him back and pinning him to the dirt. His knuckles cracked against Graves's face, once, twice, 3 times, until the man stopped moving. Jed didn't stop until Annabelle touched his shoulder. "It's done," she said softly. He stood, chest heaving, knuckles bloody. Annabelle stood beside him, her expression unreadable, but her voice calm. "You okay?" Jed looked down at Graves's broken body, then at her. "No," he said, "but I will be." Justice and aftermath. They didn't bury Graves or his men. Instead, they dragged the bodies beyond the fence line and left them for the land to deal with, the same land Graves once claimed to own. Inside the cabin, they washed in silence. Jed sat at the edge of the bed, while Annabelle stitched a gash above his brow. "You know this isn't over," she said. He nodded. "But the worst part is..." She tied off the last stitch. "You think the law will come?" "Maybe. But when they do, we'll have more than truth. We'll have lived through it." She looked at him, the scar on her thigh hidden now, but never gone. "And if they come with questions?" Jed met her eyes. "Then we'll give them answers. Together." And in that moment, with the fire crackling low and the scent of blood still faint in the floorboards, they both understood. They had survived the storm. Now they had to build something in its wake. The marshals' arrived dawn came slow and gray. The storm had passed, but its remnants clung to the ranch like smoke after fire. Jed stood at the edge of the porch, a mug of bitter coffee in his hand, staring at the 3 shallow graves they'd finally dug the night before. He hadn't wanted to waste the time, but Annabelle insisted, not because she pitied them, but because leaving their bodies for coyotes would have made her feel like she was one of them. "You don't bury men for them," she'd said. "You bury them for you." The dirt still looked too soft, like it hadn't accepted what was inside it. Behind him, the door creaked open, and Annabelle stepped out, blanket around her shoulders. Her face was paler today, but her steps steady. "I keep thinking about the first time I saw Graves," she said. "He was laughing. That same fake warmth, like he wanted everyone to believe he was just another rich cattleman. I wonder how many people smiled back while he took everything from them." Jed didn't answer. He was still too full of questions. "You think it's over?" she asked. Jed shook his head. "Graves is dead. That part's done. But the system he built, that's still breathing." Annabelle nodded slowly. "So we make it choke." They ate quietly inside, then set to work. There was too much to do to let grief settle in. The ranch needed to be put back together. Fences had been broken when the riders came. The barn door hung off its hinges. Blood still stained the dirt in front of the porch. Jed took care of the physical work. Annabelle sorted through the ledger, organizing the remaining documents they'd saved from Cheyenne. She labeled names, dates, transactions. She made a list of every person tied to Graves, every deal she'd seen, every stolen acre. When Jed returned to the house late that afternoon, sweat-soaked and sunburned, she handed him a folded paper. "What's this?" he asked. "A copy of the names." "I'm going to deliver it myself." Jed's jaw clenched. "You sure that's a good idea?" "No, but I'm sure it needs to be done." She looked him straight in the eye. "I've hidden long enough." Jed set the paper down, hands on his hips. "You go riding into Laramie with that. You're painting a target on your back." "I'm not going to Laramie," she said. "Not yet. I'm going to the territorial court in Helena. Judge Mathers holds session next month. I sent Silas a wire this morning. He said Mathers is the one who started sniffing around Graves years ago but couldn't get proof." Jed considered that. "It's a long ride. Then I'll leave at dawn." He didn't try to stop her. Instead, he fixed a bridle that had split in the barn and checked the rifle she planned to carry. That night, as they sat across from each other at the table, he said quietly, "You don't owe this world anything." Annabelle tilted her head. "That's not true. I owe it everything I've learned." The judge arrives. The marshals arrived just after first light. Jed heard them before he saw them. Boots crunching gravel, voices low and clipped, the rattle of harness and tack. He stepped out onto the porch, rifle slung but unloaded, as a group of 6 men crested the hill at the edge of his pasture. At their center rode an older man, tall and lean, wrapped in a heavy duster the color of old bone. His hat was wide-brimmed, his gaze sharp. He carried himself not like someone who wanted power, but like someone who'd spent years watching power ruin people. Judge Edwin Mathers. Behind him came federal marshals in long coats, badges pinned in plain sight. No one wore smiles. This wasn't a courtesy call. Jed waited as they dismounted, boots sinking into the dusty ground. Annabelle stepped out beside him, dressed in her riding coat, hair tied back. There was no fear in her eyes now, only clarity. Mathers took her hand first. "Miss Halt, you made good on your word." She nodded. "So did you." He turned to Jed. "Mr. Callahan, your name's come up in a lot of places lately." Jed met his gaze. Some of them true, most of them not. Mathers didn't smile. "You understand we'll need to question you. Both of you." "We do," Jed said. "But first," the judge added, glancing at the cabin behind them, "I'd like some coffee and a fire." Inside, the room was quiet but warm. Jed poured coffee while Annabelle set more wood on the flames. The marshals removed their coats, spreading them to dry near the hearth. Mathers sat at the head of the table and unrolled the documents Annabel had brought to Helena. The ledgers, the forged deeds, the list of names. He tapped a finger on one entry in particular. Abernathy, he said. We had his death down as suicide. This ledger says otherwise. Jed nodded. He was one of the first. And Graves is dead, Mathers said. Right out front, Jed said. Buried just past the tree line. The judge was quiet for a long moment, fingers steepled. Then he leaned back and let out a breath. You know, I spent 20 years fighting men like Graves with ink and law. You did it with blood and fire. He didn't leave us much choice, Annabel said softly. No, Mathers agreed. He didn't. They spent hours going over the evidence. Who saw what? When it happened? What led to the final confrontation? Jed told the truth. He didn't try to dress it up. He didn't ask for pardon, just told the facts as they happened. Annabel told hers too, but she did more than recount. She explained how a life could unravel from one small truth too dangerous to forget, how a woman could be turned into a warning, and how surviving meant choosing to fight instead of vanish. By the time they were done, the sun had dipped behind the mountains again. Mathers stood, stretching his back. There'll be hearings, maybe trials. But I can tell you now, what you've done here has ended something dark. Jed raised an eyebrow. Ended or stirred it up? Both, the judge said. But the right folks are watching now. The marshals packed up. No one asked for handcuffs. No threats were made. Just nods exchanged between men and women who understood something had shifted. Before Mathers left, he turned to Annabel. If you still want that job, it's yours. Records clerk in Helena. Safer work, important work. Annabel glanced at Jed. Jed didn't speak. He wouldn't hold her back, but the ache in his chest was undeniable. I appreciate the offer, she said. But I've got something else I want to build first. Mathers smiled for the first time. Smart girl. They rode off before dark, disappearing into the hills like smoke blown westward. Jed and Annabel stood on the porch long after the dust settled, the evening settling in around them like a blanket pulled over old bones. You sure about turning him down? Jed asked, voice low. Annabel didn't answer right away. Her eyes were fixed on the horizon. I've been running for so long, I forgot what it felt like to stay still, she said. But now that I have, I think I'd like to see what it feels like to build something from scratch. Jed looked at her. Here? She nodded. If you'll have me. Jed reached out, brushing a lock of wind-blown hair from her cheek. I was hoping you'd say that. Building something new. Summer passed into autumn with the slow rhythm of healing work. Jed rebuilt the barn. Annabel repainted the front door. They fixed fences, laid new boards, planted seeds for next year's garden. Some nights they sat together by the fire without speaking, comforted by the simple rhythm of life returned. Other nights they talked until morning about what they'd lost and what they still hoped to find. Jed no longer dreamed about Lorna's death, not because he forgot, but because the ache had turned into something quieter. A reminder of the man he'd been, a man who'd once looked away from evil and called it someone else's problem. Not anymore. Annabel still bore the scar on her thigh, but she wore it now like a brand of survival. It didn't define her. It reminded her of what she'd endured, of what she refused to be. Word came in letters delivered by traveling merchants and circuit riders. Graves's empire was crumbling. Judge Mathers had used the evidence to uncover a network of corruption that stretched from Cheyenne to Denver. Land was being returned to rightful owners. Men in high places were finding themselves in jail cells. But the best news came from an unexpected source. A young woman named Sarah Abernathy, daughter of the rancher whose death had started it all. She rode up to the Callahan Ranch one crisp October morning, leading a pack mule loaded with supplies. "Mr. Callahan?" "Miss Halt," she called from the gate. "I wanted to thank you." They invited her in for coffee and cornbread. She was barely 20, with her father's kind eyes and her own steel spine. "Papa's land came back to us," she said. "The judge said it was because of what you two did. Mama wanted me to bring you this." She handed Annabelle a small wooden box. Inside was a silver locket and a letter written in shaky handwriting. "To the brave souls who gave my husband justice. His memory lives in good ground now. Thank you for not letting evil win. Mary Abernathy." Annabelle's eyes filled, but she didn't look away from the gift. "Your father was a good man," Jed said quietly. Sarah nodded. "He always said the land remembers everything, the good and the bad. I think he'd be proud to know it remembers him now." After she left, Jed and Annabelle walked to the southern ridge, where the grass moved like waves in the afternoon breeze. Annabelle wore the locket around her neck, not as a burden, but as a promise kept. "What do you think comes next?" she asked. Jed looked out across the hills that stretched beyond sight. "We keep building. We help folks when trouble comes. We remember what we learned." She leaned against his shoulder, solid and warm. "Sounds like a good life." "Better than good," he said. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, they stood together on land that was truly theirs. Not because they owned it, but because they'd bled for it, fought for it, and chosen to make it home. The wind carried no whispers of violence now, only the promise of seasons to come. And in that promise, Jed Callahan and Annabelle Halt found something they'd both thought lost forever: peace earned through courage, love built on truth, and a future written in their own hands. Epilogue. The land remembers. 5 years later, the Callahan Ranch had grown, not in size, but in purpose. Word had spread quietly through the territory about the man and woman who'd stood against Mason Graves and lived to tell about it. Folks with nowhere else to turn began showing up at their gate. Widows cheated out of inheritance, farmers driven off their land by corrupt officials, families terrorized by men who thought power made them untouchable. Jed and Annabelle never turned anyone away. They built a second cabin for visitors who needed shelter while they sorted out their troubles. Annabelle used her skills with documents and law to help people understand their rights. Jed used his reputation and his rifle to ensure those rights were respected. Judge Mathers visited twice a year, always bringing news of legal victories built on the foundation they'd laid. The territorial government had cleaned house after the Graves scandal, and honest men were slowly replacing the corrupt ones. On a warm evening in late spring, as Jed repaired a fence post and Annabelle hung laundry to dry, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Sarah Abernathy, now married and carrying her first child, rode up with a smile that could light the darkest valley. "Mr. and Mrs. Callahan," she called, using the name they'd taken the previous winter in a simple ceremony performed by a traveling preacher. They'd never spoken of marriage until one night when Annabelle simply said, "I'd like to carry your name, if you'll have me carry mine too." And so Annabelle Halt Callahan it became, though most folks just called her Mrs. Callahan. "Sarah," Annabelle said, rushing to help her dismount, "you're glowing." "Baby's due in the fall," Sarah said, patting her belly. "But that's not why I'm here." She reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a leather portfolio. "The territorial legislature is meeting in Helena next month. They want to pass a law, the Graves Prevention Act, they're calling it. It would make land fraud a federal crime and establish protections for witnesses who come forward." Jed raised an eyebrow. "Fancy name." "They want you both there," Sarah continued, "to testify before the legislature, to tell your story so it becomes part of the official record." Annabelle and Jed exchanged glances. "We're not much for speeches," Jed said. "You don't need to give speeches," Sarah smiled. "You just need to tell the truth. Same as you always have." That night, as they discussed the invitation over supper, Annabelle traced the silver locket she still wore, Mary Abernathy's gift that had become her daily reminder of why they'd fought. "It feels strange," she said, "thinking our story might help change things for people we'll never meet." Strange good or strange bad? Jed asked. She considered that. Strange hopeful, I think. They went to Helena that summer. They told their story to a room full of legislators, lawyers, and newspaper reporters. They spoke simply, truthfully, without trying to make themselves heroes. They talked about fear, about choices, about the moment when running away becomes impossible and standing up becomes the only option left. The Graves Prevention Act passed unanimously, but the real victory came later, in smaller moments. A letter from a widow in Colorado who'd used the new law to reclaim her husband's mining claim. A visit from a young man in Montana who'd exposed corruption in his county government and lived to see justice done. A telegram from Judge Mathers announcing the conviction of the last of Graves's associates. Each victory was a seed planted in soil watered by their courage. One evening, as autumn painted the hills golden red, Jed and Annabelle sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The ranch was quiet, except for the gentle lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the grass. "Do you ever miss it?" Annabelle asked. "The quiet life we might have had if none of this happened?" Jed thought for a long moment. "I miss Lorna every day. I miss the innocence of thinking evil would leave you alone if you left it alone. But miss this life?" He looked at her, then at the land stretching endlessly around them. "No. This is the life I was meant to live. With you." She leaned against his shoulder, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "The land remembers," she said, echoing Sarah's father. "What do you think it remembers about us?" Jed smiled, the kind of smile that came from deep contentment rather than easy happiness. "I think it remembers the day two broken people decided they were stronger together than they ever were apart. I think it remembers the day evil rode onto this ranch and found itself outmatched. As if in response, a gentle breeze stirred the grass, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers, and something else, something that felt like approval, like peace, like promise. The land remembered, and it was good. The end."